Tessie pushed open her office door and stopped. A man was sitting in her chair. Not standing, not pacing. Sitting, like he owned the room, like he had time, like the blood soaking through the left side of his shirt was somebody else's problem. Two men flanked her window, back straight, hands visible, eyes on her the second she walked in. Her brain did what 3 years of emergency medicine trained it to do. It cataloged everything in under 2 seconds. GSW. Left lateral torso. Entry wound. No visible exit. He'd packed it himself with something that wasn't gauze. His breathing was controlled but shallow. He was losing blood slower than he should be, which meant he'd done this before, or someone who'd done this before had taught him how to sit still and not die. The two men by the window hadn't moved. That was almost worse. Tessie's hand found the metal instrument tray before her mind gave the instruction. She swung. He caught her wrist. No scramble, no panic, just his hand closing around hers like he'd mapped the whole thing out before she walked in. The tray crashed. The sound split the silence open. The two men shifted and she felt the air in the room change. Thicker, closer. But the man in her chair held up one finger without looking at them, and they went still again. His eyes came back to hers. Dark. Exhausted. Calm in a way that made her skin crawl, because calm didn't belong in this room right now. I'm not here to hurt you. English. Perfect, quiet, unhurried. Please don't make noise. His grip loosened. Not releasing, loosening. Returning the choice to her. Tessie's heart was slamming against her ribs. Her office door was still open behind her. The corridor was empty. She'd checked without meaning to, survival instinct running faster than conscious thought. She could scream. She could run. She had options. Except he'd said please. And he knew her name. She hadn't told him. There was no name tag on her coat. Her office door said Dr. T. Williams, but he hadn't said Dr. Williams. He'd said Tessie. Quietly. Like he'd been saying it for a while. Close the door, he said. She closed the door. She hated that she closed the door. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments. And hit subscribe, because what happens next in this office will make you forget you were ever tired. Tessie pulled her coat off and threw it on the hook by the door. Old habit. Her hands were already moving toward the supply cabinet before she'd made a conscious decision to treat him, which annoyed her, because the decision should have been deliberate. It should have come with conditions and demands, and at least one very clear thread about what happened if those two men by the window so much as breath wrong. Instead, her hands were moving and her mouth was running the way it always did when she was working. Take the shirt off. He reached for his buttons. His fingers were steady, which told her the blood loss wasn't critical yet. She noted that the way she noted everything. Fast, clinical, filed. How long ago? 2 hours. Who packed it? I did. She peeled back what he'd used. Torn fabric, not gauze, pressed hard and held with pressure rather than tied, which was actually smart if you had nothing else. She'd seen worse. She'd seen a man come into her ER in Chicago with a kitchen knife still in his shoulder because someone told him removing it would make it worse, and he believed them, and he'd driven himself 40 minutes with one hand on the wheel. She'd seen a lot of things. She hadn't seen this. The wound was clean. Entry only, like she'd clocked from the door, but what caught her attention was the positioning. Whoever fired the shot had been standing at an angle that suggested the target wasn't running. He'd been standing still, which meant he'd chosen not to move. She filed that too. This is going to hurt. I know. It did. She watched his jaw tighten and his knuckles go white against the arm of her chair, but he didn't make a sound. Not one. The two men by the window were watching her with the kind of attention that made the back of her neck prickle, and she wanted to tell them to look somewhere else. But she needed them calm more than she needed her dignity right now. You're going to need imaging to confirm no internal. No imaging. There could be fragment. No imaging. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It had that quality, the kind that came from years of people listening the first time. Tessie pressed harder than she needed to on the cleaning swab. His jaw tightened again. She felt slightly better about herself. How do you know my name? Silence. The kind that wasn't empty. The kind that had weight in it, decisions being made behind it. You treated someone close to me. 8 months ago. Trauma Bay, 4th floor. He paused. You stayed with him for 6 hours. You didn't have to. She remembered. She hadn't known who the man was. She still didn't, not fully. He'd come in with no ID, multiple lacerations, and 2 men who stood exactly like these two were standing now. She treated him because that was her job, and she'd stayed because he'd been scared in a way he was trying very hard not to show, and scared patients did better when someone sat with them. That was medicine. That was basic. He survived because of you, the man in her chair said quietly. That's why I'm here and not at a hospital where people ask questions. Tessie pulled the suture thread through and said nothing for a moment. There were approximately 7 responses she could give to that, ranging from professional to absolutely not, and she was cycling through them when her pager went off. Code blue. 3rd floor. Pediatric ward. Her hand stopped. The man watched her face shift. He'd seen it before probably. The way doctors left their bodies for a second when the code came in. The way something clicked over behind the eyes. Go, he said. I'm not done. You've done enough. Go. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she grabbed her coat off the hook, pulled the door open, and ran. The code took 41 minutes. She worked on a 7-year-old boy who had a name she already knew because she'd reviewed his chart 3 times that week. And when he stabilized and the room exhaled and the attending clapped her on the shoulder and said good work, she stood there for a moment with her gloves still on and realized she hadn't thought about the man in her office once. Not once, which was its own kind of strange. She walked back. The office was empty. Not just empty, clean. The torn fabric was gone. The swabs were gone. Her tray was back in place. The chair had been moved back to exactly where it usually sat, which she knew because there was a faint indent in the rug that she'd never bothered correcting. Tessie stood in the doorway of her own office and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A very specific kind of unease that lived below the stomach. The kind that came not from fear, but from the certainty that something had shifted in her world, and she hadn't been the one to shift it. She looked down. There was a blood trail. Faint. Someone had tried to wipe it, but she was a doctor and she knew what dried blood looked like on linoleum. She followed it with her eyes to the door, into the corridor, left toward the service exit. She followed it. 10 feet. 12. 15. Then nothing. The trail stopped. Completely. No smear. No drag. No door that could account for an exit. Just nothing. Like he'd been lifted out of the building. If you're enjoying the story so far, hit the subscribe button right now. Because this story is only getting started. Tessie stood in an empty hospital corridor at midnight and stared at the floor where a man's blood trail ended in the middle of nowhere, and she told herself, firmly, clearly, the way she told patients things they didn't want to hear, that this was not her problem. She went home. She should not have gone home. The kitchen light was on. Tessie stood in her own doorway for the 2nd time that night, with the very same feeling crawling up her spine. She lived alone. She had lived alone for all 3 years in Seoul. She had a deadbolt and a chain lock and a window latch she checked every single night because old habits from Chicago didn't die, they just relocated. Every latch was undone. From the inside, she could smell food. Not just food. She could smell doenjang jjigae, which was the fermented soybean paste stew that her neighbor Mrs. Park made every Sunday, and which smelled nothing like whatever Tessie usually threw together at midnight when she remembered to eat. Someone was cooking in her kitchen, properly cooking, with the good pot she kept in the back cabinet because she never used it. She walked in. He was standing at her stove, shirt on, new shirt, or someone had found him a new shirt, with a bandage visible at his side that was far better applied than what she'd done in 20 minutes at the hospital. He moved around her kitchen like he'd been in it before. That was the thing that got her, not the fact that he was there. The fact that he wasn't looking for things. He knew where things were. How did you get in here? You should eat, he said. You've been on shift since 7 this morning. That is not what I asked. He turned from the stove. He looked better than he had in her office, color returning, breathing even. He looked like a man who had simply decided to be fine, and his body had complied because it didn't dare argue. Sit down, Tessie. Do not tell me to sit down in my own kitchen. He looked at her for a moment. Then he turned back to the stove. I'll leave, he said, when it's safe. I need a few days. You need, she stopped. Breathed. Tried again. You need a few days. In my apartment. That you broke into. I didn't break anything. That is the least important part of what I just said. He moved the pot off the heat and faced her fully. And there it was again, that quality. Not threatening. Not aggressive. Just completely, unnervingly settled in himself. Like a man who had calculated every outcome in the room and had decided he could live with all of them. There are people looking for me, he said. If they find me in a hospital, the hospital becomes a problem. If they find me in a hotel, the hotel staff become a problem? He paused. You already know about me. That makes you a variable I can manage. A variable you can manage. Yes. I am a 34-year-old black woman from Atlanta who moved to Seoul to be left alone, Tessie said. I am nobody's variable. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. Closer to the edge of one. Like it started and then thought better of itself. Hey Soul, he said. I don't care. My name. Hey Soul. She stared at him. Is that supposed to make me feel better? It's supposed to make us even. You know my name. I know yours. Tessie pulled out a chair and sat down. Not because she'd decided to accept any part of this, but because her feet hurt and she'd been awake for 17 hours and the stew smelled extraordinary and she was only human. 3 days, she said. He nodded. You sleep on the couch. You don't touch my things. You don't answer my door. You don't use my phone. And you tell me enough that I know whether I need to be scared. He sat down across from her. Served the stew like they'd done this before. Like this was a normal Tuesday. You don't need to be scared, he said. Not yet. Not yet. Tessie picked up her spoon and thought about all the ways that sentence could end, and decided that thinking about it wasn't going to change any of them. Here's where it gets crazy. She woke up the next morning to find her bookshelf reorganized. Not dramatically, not like someone had gone through it looking for something. Subtly, 3 books had been moved, face out instead of spine out. In a way she'd been meaning to do herself for months because she kept forgetting which ones she'd recommended to patients. The specific ones she recommended most. 3 years of recommending them, which meant 3 years of data that did not exist anywhere he could have accessed. She stood in front of her bookshelf in her pajamas and felt the hair on her arms stand up. He was on the couch with his eyes closed. Or he appeared to be. Did you touch my books? No. 3 of them are moved. Silence. Hey, Soul. He opened his eyes, looked at the shelf, looked at her, and said nothing, which was somehow its own confirmation. Tessie went to make coffee and told herself there was a rational explanation and spent the entire time it took the coffee to brew failing to produce one. By day 2 she'd noticed other things. He knew she took her coffee without sugar before she told him. He knew she worked nights Tuesday through Thursday and adjusted when he moved around the apartment accordingly. He knew she had a second deadbolt she didn't use because the key stuck, and on the second morning she found it oiled and turning smoothly. She hadn't told him any of it. She came home on the second night to find him watching the news with the volume very low and his face very still, and she knew from the way he was sitting, forward, elbows on knees, the posture of a man receiving bad news he'd been expecting, that something had happened. She sat in the armchair across from him and watched the broadcast. She didn't speak Korean fluently, but she'd been in Seoul long enough to catch words, fragments, enough to build a rough picture. She caught the words for illegal. She caught the words for operation and raid and arrested. She caught a name, a family name, that she'd heard him say quietly on the phone the night before. She looked at him. His jaw was set. His eyes hadn't moved from the screen. Your family, she said. My brother. A pause. He's telling people I sold them out. That I gave information to the police. Did you? He looked at her then, long and steady. No, he said. But it doesn't matter what I did. It matters what they believe. Tessie leaned back in her chair. Outside the window, Seoul hummed along, entirely indifferent to the fact that whatever was happening in this apartment had apparently developed roots she hadn't noticed growing. What does that mean for you? It means the danger I told you was coming. He stopped. Started again, more carefully. It's closer than I said. If you're still watching and you're invested in what happens to these 2, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps. And keep watching because what happens next in this apartment will change everything. Tessie had a very specific rule about not getting involved in things that had nothing to do with her. She had built that rule carefully, over years, after a version of herself who got involved in everything had ended up in Seoul running from the consequences of caring too much. She was protective of that rule the way some people were protective of family heirlooms. She looked at HAE-SOL sitting on her couch with the weight of a collapsing world on his face, not asking for anything, not performing vulnerability, just sitting with it the way people sat with things they decided they could carry alone. She hated how well she recognized that. What do you need? She said. He looked at her like she'd surprised him. Like despite everything, despite the bookshelf and the coffee and the fact that he'd clearly been watching her life long enough to know the small specific details of it. He had not expected that question. Nothing, he said. Not from you. That's not what I asked. He was quiet for a long time. long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer, long enough that she picked up her phone and pretended to look at something. Information, he said finally. A meeting. A way to prove what I didn't do. And how does a doctor help with that? He looked at the window. She doesn't, he said. Unless she's willing to be somewhere she shouldn't be, at a time she'd rather not know about. Doing something that requires her to look completely unremarkable. Tessie put her phone down. Unremarkable, she said flatly. I am a 6-foot black woman in Seoul, HAE-SOL. Unremarkable is not in my vocabulary. That time, the almost smile made it all the way. But wait, she didn't know yet what he actually needed her for. And when she found out, she wished she'd stayed quiet. Her apartment was searched while she was at work the following day. She knew it the moment she walked in. Not because anything was obviously missing or destroyed, because it wasn't. Whoever had done it was professional and careful and had gone through every room with the specific unhurried thoroughness of people who'd been taught how to look. But Tessie had lived alone for 3 years, and she knew the particular geometry of her own space the way you knew a body you'd been in for decades. She knew where she put things. She knew the angles. 3 things were wrong. A drawer closed completely that she always left half an inch open because the runner stuck. A framed photo on her dresser turned 1 degree clockwise. And the book on her nightstand, the one she was currently reading, page 147, spine cracked at the chapter she'd stopped, was face down instead of face up. Someone had read the page she'd stopped on. She stood in her bedroom doorway for a long time. Then she called HAE-SOL. He picked up on the first ring. My apartment was searched, she said. Silence on his end. Then, are you inside right now? Yes. Leave. Go somewhere public. Don't go to the hospital. HAE-SOL. Tessie. His voice had changed. Not louder, denser. Like it had contracted around something urgent. Please. Not now. Just go. She went. She sat in a cafe 3 blocks away and drank a coffee she didn't taste and thought about the photo turned 1 degree clockwise and the book face down on page 147. And she thought about what kind of person turned a photo and read a page and then left. And she thought about what they were looking for. And she thought about whether they found it. He met her at the cafe 40 minutes later. He sat down across from her, and he looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made something tighten in his expression. I'm sorry, he said. Don't, she said. Don't apologize yet. Tell me what they wanted. Something I left with you. She stared at him. You left something in my apartment. In your medical bag. When you came back from the code blue. He held her gaze. A drive. Small. I need it back. You put something in my medical bag. I needed it not to be on me. Tessie leaned across the table. She kept her voice very, very even. HAE-SOL, if you do not tell me exactly what is happening right now, I will stand up, walk out of this cafe, go to the nearest police station, and tell them everything I know, which is currently more than I want it to be. Do you understand me? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he told her, not everything. She would only understand later that it wasn't everything. But enough. Enough that the picture she'd been looking at in pieces suddenly had a frame. HAE-SOL ran, or had run, one of the most organized distribution operations in East Asia. Not the violence, he was specific about that, not the worst of it, but enough that there was no clean version of his hands. His brother had been slowly building a case against him for 2 years, not for the authorities, but for the family, the larger network, positioning himself as the loyal one, the one who hadn't been compromised. The raid the other night had been engineered. The arrests had been selective in a way that pointed fingers without requiring evidence. The drive in her medical bag had proof. Correspondence. Numbers. Dates that didn't match the story his brother was telling. If I don't get that information to the right people, HAE-SOL said quietly, my brother takes everything. And everyone associated with me. Everyone they can find. Everyone whose name appears anywhere. Becomes a way to send a message. Tessie sat with that. Including me, she said. You're already in the file, Tessie. You have been since the hospital. Since you treated my man. He paused. I'm sorry. I should have. Don't. She held up a hand. Just. Don't. What's the plan? He looked at her like she'd surprised him again. Like he kept expecting her to be a different kind of person, and she kept not being it. There's a transfer, he said. Medical supplies. Legitimate on paper. I need someone to escort the shipment through a checkpoint. Someone with credentials. Someone with a reason to be there that no one questions. A doctor, Tessie said. He nodded. You want me to walk a shipment through a military checkpoint? You wouldn't be alone. HAE-SOL. She rubbed her face. I did not leave Atlanta and move to Seoul and study 14 years to become a human decoy. I know. I have a license. I have a career. I know. Quieter. I know what you have. I know what it cost you to build it. He leaned forward slightly. That's why I'm asking instead of telling. You can say no. I'll find another way. She looked at him across the table of a cafe where the music was soft and the lighting was warm, and the whole world outside the window was completely unbothered by the fact that her life had turned a corner she hadn't seen coming. You'll find another way, she said. Yes. And that other way will be slower and less certain. And if it fails, he didn't answer, which was its own answer. Tessie looked out the window for a long time. Then she said, tell me exactly what I'd have to do. If you are enjoying this story, hit the subscribe button. You do not want to miss what happens at that checkpoint. I know. Quieter. I know what you have. I know what it cost you to build it. He leaned forward slightly. That's why I'm asking instead of telling. You can say no. I'll find another way. She looked at him across the table of a cafe where the music was soft and the lighting was warm, and the whole world outside the window was completely unbothered by the fact that her life had turned a corner she hadn't seen coming. You'll find another way, she said. Yes. And that other way will be slower and less certain. And if it fails, he didn't answer, which was its own answer. Tessie looked out the window for a long time. Then she said, tell me exactly what I'd have to do. If you are enjoying this story, hit the subscribe button. You do not want to miss what happens at that checkpoint. The checkpoint was on a Tuesday. She'd had 4 days to prepare, and she'd spent all 4 of them rehearsing the way she rehearsed for board exams, obsessively, methodically, running through every question she might be asked until the answers came before the questions finished forming. She dressed like herself. That had been HAE-SOL's instruction, and it was the only smart one available. Don't perform. Don't costume. Be so completely yourself that there's nothing for anyone to find. She wore her hospital ID. She carried her medical bag, the one she carried every day, the one with her real supplies and the real documentation for the transfer, and the small drive now sewn into the inner lining of her coat pocket, where it pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. She did not know where HAE-SOL was. That had been the arrangement. Separation, distance, no visible connection. He would be close. He'd said so. She'd had to decide whether that was comforting or not. She decided it was neither and got in the van. The drive took 40 minutes. She reviewed the documentation 3 more times. The 2 men in the van with her said nothing, and she was grateful for that, because she had a feeling that if anyone spoke to her right now, she would either respond completely normally or absolutely not at all, and she couldn't predict which. The checkpoint came into view. Military. 2 lanes. For officers visible, 2 more further back. The kind of setup that existed to look thorough even when it wasn't, and to be thorough on the days it decided to be. Today it decided to be. The officer who approached her window was young, methodical, and had the particular energy of someone who had learned that everyone was suspicious until proven otherwise. He looked at her documentation for a long time. He looked at her face. You're the attending physician? Yes. For the severance transfer. Correct. We don't often see foreign doctors on these transfers. Tessie had prepared for this. She'd prepared for exactly this. The hospital has been coordinating with Dr. Kim's department for the past 3 months, she said. I can give you his direct line if there's any question about authorization. The officer looked at her for another moment. She kept her face exactly where it was, attentive, mildly impatient the way every doctor was mildly impatient, completely unbothered by the extra scrutiny. He went back to the documentation. Then the radio on his belt crackled. And then one of the officers at the rear of the checkpoint looked toward the van and did something that made every nerve in Tessie's body fire at once. He looked too long. Not at the van. At the shadow beyond the van where a car had slowed on the opposite lane. She didn't turn her head. She didn't move. The radio crackled again. The officer in front of her looked up. The 10 seconds that followed were the longest 10 seconds of Tessie's life. Longer than the ones in the operating room. Longer than the ones waiting for results she already knew were bad. The officer in front of her had paused. His hand was resting on the door frame. The 2 men in the van were completely still. Then the officer behind said something short and clipped over the radio, and the one in front of her looked back at the documentation 1 more time and handed it through the window. Have a good evening, doctor. She said thank you. She did not exhale until the checkpoint was behind them and the city had swallowed the van whole. She sat in the back with her hands in her lap and her heart rate at approximately twice its resting value, and she thought, I am never doing that again. I am never, in my life, doing anything like that again. Her phone buzzed. One message. No name. It just said, well done. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes and thought about the 7 different life choices that had led her to this specific van on this specific Tuesday, and decided that at least one of them had been genuinely avoidable. She met him that night. Not at her apartment. Neutral ground. His idea, a restaurant in a part of Seoul she'd never been to that didn't look like the kind of place anything remarkable ever happened, which she now understood was the entire point. He was already there when she arrived. He stood when she walked in, which she hadn't expected, and something about that small automatic gesture, completely out of place with everything she knew about him, knocked her slightly off balance. They ate. They talked. Not about any of it at first. Not about the checkpoint or the drive or the brother or the operation. They talked about Atlanta. About the specific quality of summer there, the weight of it, the way the heat was personal rather than just climatic. About what made her choose medicine. About the 6 hours she'd spent with a man she didn't know in a trauma bay 8 months ago because he'd been scared and she'd seen it. Why do you really do it? HAE-SOL said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. Like the answer mattered to him in a way that had nothing to do with information. TESSY considered the real answer instead of the prepared one. Because when I was 12, she said, my mother went to the hospital with a headache and came home 3 weeks later with a diagnosis that changed everything. And the one doctor who sat down and talked to her like she was a person, like she was worth the time, she said that doctor was the reason she wasn't scared. Not the treatment. The person. She paused. I wanted to be that for people. HAE-SOL was quiet for a moment. You are, he said. It was a simple thing to say. It shouldn't have landed the way it did. They stayed at the restaurant for 2 hours longer than she'd planned. Outside, Seoul moved through its night like it always did, indifferent and alive. And inside this small, unremarkable restaurant that wasn't supposed to be the location of anything meaningful, something was building that neither of them was acknowledging out loud, because naming it made it real, and real things could be used against you. When they finally stood to leave, he walked her to the street, and they stood for a moment in that specific kind of silence that was full rather than empty. HAE-SOL, she started. I know, he said. She looked at him. You don't know what I was going to say. No, he admitted. But I know the feeling that makes someone say it. She stood there with Seoul around her and thought that was either the most or least reassuring thing he could have said. He left first. She watched him go, and she told herself, firmly, cleanly, the way she told herself true things she didn't particularly want to deal with, that this was complicated and temporary, and she was not the kind of woman who lost her footing over a man, especially not this one, especially not now. She walked home. Her apartment was warm and quiet and entirely hers, and she went to bed and stared at the ceiling for a while and thought about the way he'd said well done and the way he'd stood when she walked in and the specific sentence. I know the feeling that makes someone say it. She fell asleep thinking about it. She woke up to flowers on her doorstep. No note. No name. White gardenias, which had no business being there because gardenias weren't in season and they weren't common in this part of Seoul, and they were specifically the flower that sat in a blue vase in the one photo on her bookshelf, the photo that had been turned 1 degree clockwise by whoever searched her apartment. She stood in her doorway holding the gardenias and understood, slowly, that the line between surveilled and seen had just become very thin. Flowers appeared every 3 days after that. Always gardenias. Always early morning, before she left for her shift. Never with a note. She didn't ask. He didn't explain. There was a conversation happening between them that neither of them was having out loud, and TESSY was not a woman who did things halfway, which meant that the not-quite conversation was getting louder every day, and she was having a harder and harder time pretending it wasn't. He called her on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the checkpoint. I'd like to have dinner with you, he said. Properly. Not for any reason except that. TESSY was standing in her kitchen with a coffee she hadn't drunk yet, and she thought about all the sensible things she could say in response to that invitation. Okay, she said. The restaurant was private in a way that wasn't performative, a room at the back, quiet, the kind of place where the staff understood that their discretion was part of the service. He was dressed differently than she'd seen him before, less armored somehow, And that was the word her brain produced. Armored. Like he usually wore the way he carried himself as protection, and tonight he decided to put some of it down. They talked about things that mattered, not surface things. He told her something about his childhood, not details, shapes. The outline of a boy who had been handed a world he didn't choose and had walked into it because the alternative was abandoning everyone inside it. She told him something true about the woman she'd been in Chicago, before Seoul, before the careful rebuilt quiet. Something she hadn't said out loud in 3 years. He listened the way people listen when they already knew how important what you were saying was. Halfway through the evening, he put his hand over hers on the table. Not dramatically, just placed it there. An acknowledgement. She didn't move her hand. Later, during dessert he didn't eat, and coffee she was mostly just holding. He looked at her and said, "After tonight, everything changes." She watched his face. What does that mean? Something complicated moved through his expression. Something that looked like it was trying to be relief, but hadn't quite made it there yet. "It means I'm close to finishing this," he said. "The proof. The meeting. If it goes the way I think it will," he paused, "I can stop disappearing." She held his gaze. "And if it doesn't, then I'll have at least had tonight." He said it simply, without drama, the way he said things that he'd already made peace with. Tessie sat across from him in this small private room with the city outside and the flowers he'd been leaving on her doorstep, and the weight of everything they'd been to each other in a very short time that didn't feel short at all. And she thought about all the versions of this conversation that could happen and which one she wanted. She chose the one she wanted. She reached across the table, put her hand over his. "Don't talk like that," she said. He turned his hand over, held hers. They stayed until the restaurant was empty. He walked her home. They stood outside her building in the dark, Seoul doing what Seoul did. And there was a moment, a genuine, full, held moment, where the world contracted to this specific piece of pavement and these two specific people and whatever was true between them that had been building since a metal tray hit the floor in a hospital office. He left before she could ask him to stay. She watched him go. She went inside. She slept. She woke up and he was gone. Not from her apartment. She hadn't invited him back. Gone from his phone, which rang once and then stopped existing. Gone from the contact she had for him, which disconnected. Gone from the restaurant they'd been to, whose staff, when she called 2 days later with some excuse she'd invented, told her politely that they had no record of a reservation. Gone the way he'd been gone from her office that first night, completely and suddenly, leaving behind a space shaped exactly like him. Tessie waited a week. She waited another week. She told herself this was fine, that this was always how it was going to go, that she'd known that she'd chosen it anyway, and that she was capable of being fine. She was fine. She was fine for several weeks, actually, until the morning she sat on the bathroom floor of her apartment with a test in her hand, and a result she stared at for a very long time. And then she was not fine at all. She didn't cry. She sat on the floor for a while. She did the math she needed to do and confirmed the math and then did it again. She thought about calling someone, and then thought about who she would call, and the answer to that question was the same person it had been for weeks, and that person's phone was disconnected. She went to work. She treated patients. She was, by every external measurement, completely functional. Inside she was building something. Not quite anger, not quite grief, the specific compound emotion that came from choosing to trust someone and then having the data of that choice returned to you in the worst possible way. She found his address after 3 weeks of trying through channels she told herself she'd never use again. A contact she had from her early Seoul days. A journalist who knew people who knew buildings, who owed her a favor she'd been sitting on for 2 years. She took a cab. It was a building in a quieter part of the city. Good building, understated. The kind of building that didn't advertise itself. She stood outside it for 20 minutes, running through the conversation she was going to have. Clear, controlled, not cruel, but completely direct. She deserved answers. He owed her that. She pressed the buzzer. The door opened. A woman stood there. Korean. Beautiful. Somewhere in her 30s. Wearing a loose top that she'd last seen on a version of herself 4 months ago, before she'd had to start adjusting for what the months were doing to her silhouette. Because the woman was also pregnant. Visibly. Undeniably. The two women looked at each other. Tessie's carefully constructed conversation dissolved completely. "I'm looking for HAE-SOL," she said. Her voice came out steady, which she would be grateful for later. The woman's expression shifted. Something complicated passing through it. Recognition, pain, something Tessie couldn't read. I haven't seen him, the woman said. For months. A pause. Not since. She stopped herself. Who are you? Tessie stood on that doorstep and felt reality doing something underneath her feet. The math she'd already done, she was doing it again. Faster. Against a different timeline. When did you last see him? Tessie said. The woman told her. The date was before the dinner. Before the checkpoint. Before the hospital. Before the office. Before the metal tray and the 4 words I am not armed. The timeline didn't match. None of it matched. The woman looked at Tessie's face and then looked at Tessie. Really looked, and her expression changed again into something Tessie really didn't want to interpret. He told me I was the only one he could come to, the woman said quietly. When he needed help. He said there was no one else. The air left the doorstep. Tessie stood very still. I was the only one I could come to. For words. The exact 4 words he had said to her in the hospital. In her office. In the dark with the blood trail and the 2 men at the window and the particular exhausted sincerity she had believed because she was a person who recognized sincerity and she had been so certain. She pulled out her phone. She didn't know what she was looking for. She typed his name, his full name, which she'd found during the 3 weeks of trying, which felt like the only true thing she had right now, into the search bar. The first result was a news article. It was 8 months old. She read the headline once. Read it again. Her brain processed each word individually, independently, like they were arriving from different directions and needed time to assemble. The article had a photo. She knew the face. She had sutured the body attached to that face. She had held that wrist and had her wrist held in return, and she had cooked across from it in her kitchen and sat across from it in a restaurant and stood outside her building in the dark with Seoul around them. The article said he had died 8 months ago, a month before he walked into her office bleeding. A month before I'm not here to hurt you, and please don't make noise, and you were the only one I could come to. Tessie stood on a stranger's doorstep in Seoul with the phone in her hand, and the city going on entirely without her consent, and one sentence forming somewhere beneath every rational thing she'd ever believed about the world. Who was he? If you need to know what happens next, and you do, because this story is nowhere near finished, comment part 2 right now. Tell me in the comments. And if you've been here from the beginning, hit like, hit subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Because we are just getting started. And what's coming in part 2? We'll make this look like the beginning of something much, much darker.